Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 in our Design Principles series. If you haven't seen part 1, I strongly suggest you go watch it right now, as I think Christina did a great job covering a lot of information in that video regarding reference sources and right and wrong ways of using reference. In this video, I want to talk about different ways of using reference when it comes to creating art and also studying from. I want to show you guys how you can break down the reference to study from it and build your visual library that way. I will demonstrate different ways of interpreting reference within the context of a character design as an example. Finally, I will go over how I use certain 3D tools Christina also talked about in my own workflow. Okay, let's get started. Let's start by talking about using reference to study from and how I approach this. The method I like using most is based around the idea of deconstructing the reference down to primitive shapes. By that, I mean using a very simplified shape language of boxes, spheres, cylinders, and pyramids. We can use these simple shapes to break down the structure of this Armour reference here. For now, we are just going to focus on the arm. As you can see, I start by breaking it down to simple cylindrical shapes. I'm drawing over it right now to show you guys my thought process, but ideally you want all this stuff to happen in your head as you are looking at the piece of reference. Of course, if you're a beginner, there's no harm in practicing by drawing over. Actually, it can really help for you to understand how to simplify things down. But eventually you should move up to a level where you don't have to draw over the reference and you can just look at it and simplify it in your head, then transfer that onto paper or digital canvas. Even the breastplate here can be simplified down to a box at the beginning. This can help you establish the perspective and the proportions before you start defining the actual shape of it. Okay, so here's the full process of me studying a piece of reference like this. As you can see, as I start sketching it out, I'm only focusing on using primitive shapes to establish the proportions and the placement of everything. There's no point in going into detail right now. I just want to keep things really simple. This way I can really focus on understanding how this piece of armor is constructed. If you are doing a study, you shouldn't be focusing on just drawing what you are seeing, but also really understanding how that thing is put together. Once I'm happy with my foundation, I lower the opacity on this layer, create a new layer on top, and start drawing again. This time, I'm focusing on the smaller shapes and fleshing out the drawing. I'm still refraining from drawing the very fine details, but instead I prioritize the bigger shapes first. This is also when I start to pay attention to the connections and overlapping shapes. I'm constantly making observations on how this piece of armor has been put together and making mental notes on it. You can always take the time to study the smaller details as well, but it's best not to get too lost in them. There's a point of diminishing returns in a study, and once you feel like you are just doodling than, learning, it might be best to move on to the next thing. First thing I want to break down is 3 different ways of interpreting reference when you are working on a design. Of course, this is how I simplify it, and it's not like a concrete rule or anything like that. But I think it will help communicate my approach if I break things down a bit. I'll be using a part of a character design process as an example, but you will see that any of these methods can be used for a lot of different design processes. None of this is strictly limited to character design necessarily. Okay, so here we have a quick character design sketch that is in process. Alright, we are just going to use this as an example, as a base. Now, let's say I want to add a shoulder armor on this character. Now, I can Google cool shoulder armor or something along those lines to find some reference to help me with that. Then all I have to do is draw one of these, or maybe a little mishmash a couple of these ideas. That is one way of approaching this problem, and I call this the literal approach. With the literal approach, we are following the reference pretty closely and focusing on accuracy more than anything else. Now, this type of approach can have its place For example, if you were to be working on a game that is grounded on reality, and that needs characters wearing equipment that is based on real-life equipment, weapons, etc. In this case, you need to do your research really well and make sure your designs fit the project's parameters, such as a specific timeline this story might be taking place in, or maybe it's limited to a certain geographical part of the world. A movie that takes place in 14th century France will have people wearing clothing of that era from that region. How much creative license you can have based on that will vary from project to project, of course, but it's always a good idea to start with a good understanding of the basis. Okay, let's say we have more freedom now and we want to push the design of this shoulder armor and make it look more bold and exaggerated. So we'll be going with the stylized approach. I got all these new references now added on the screen, as you can see. And I want these new references to guide my design into something a little more unusual, but also making sure it will still read as a piece of shoulder armor. I've put our previous concept up there in the corner, just so I can look at it and remind myself of what I've just designed. Because I want this new concept to be echoing that previous design, but also I want it to be something more, something a little bit more different. I think the key here is to make sure the shoulder armor still looks practical enough, very much like the previous design, but not so grounded in reality, something a little bit more fantasy. You know, we are not pushing so far into high fantasy, but it's stylized enough to look cool, to look a little bit more interesting, but also still it looks like it's grounded in reality and not something that's really totally abstracted and out there. Adding these details like the straps, the bolts, the nuts and bolts that holds the different parts of the armor together, things like that really help the concept look more believable. Now let's step back a bit, as I wanted to explain further how I used the reference that I got to inspire the concept. I'm going to draw over the shapes that I liked in these references and try to show how they have dictated the concept that I sketched out. I'm basically picking parts from different references and molding them together into a new design. I don't always take those shapes out as they are and just stitch them together, but it's more about finding these parts that you like and being able to create a flow between them. And now it's time for the final method. I call this one the abstracted approach. As you can see from the references that I have, we are getting away from using directly related reference. If you want to design a shoulder armor, you don't necessarily have to be looking at literal shoulder armor examples. This time, we are purely thinking about shapes. To explain this better, I'm starting out by drawing out the shapes that I really liked in these references to show you guys how these references did end up dictating the concept. With this approach, you can find inspiration in the most unlikely places. For example, this piece of sculpture gave me the idea of a type of armor that could be wrapping around someone's arm with the plates layering over each other to offer protection. The final concept might not reflect that completely, but I believe it's really useful to cast a wide net when looking for inspiration. I'm keeping things very loose as I start sketching. I'm looking for interesting shapes that will create a unique silhouette, and as I'm doing this, I'm constantly glancing at my reference board to remind myself of the original shapes that inspired me in the first place. After getting the shapes down and I established the proportions, I start thinking about the functionality of this piece of armor. Ideally, this still should look like it can be worn by someone, even if I'm not going into explaining how it's strapped to the body and how the different parts are connected together. It still needs to look believable enough that it won't break that suspension of disbelief. And here you can see me totally space out and add lots of details in the sketch. Not necessary at all for this demonstration, but I can't help myself at times. I just totally space out and I'm just scribbling and scribbling, adding all these unnecessary details. Usually when I get to this stage, I know that I should stop right away and move on to the next thing. Okay, now that I've finished the abstracted design, let's go over all of the concepts and have another look. Here's the first one, the more literal design, the literal approach rather. And now the second one, as you can see, we are getting more stylized, a little bit more exaggerated shapes, more detail, followed by the abstracted design. And as you can see here, it's a lot more high fantasy, a lot more sort of crazy shapes, exaggerated proportions, but still there's a semblance of functionality in there. Right, I'm sure we've all heard this one, and we probably thought about it ourselves as well. You know, when people say, I can't find good reference. I hear people complain about this fairly regularly. Now, I'm trying to be sympathetic, and believe me, it can be frustrating to have a very specific idea and then try to find something that matches that. But, you know, nothing is stopping you from making that reference yourself if you can't find it. Here are some examples of my work when I shot my own reference to help me in the process. You really don't need a fancy studio environment and any equipment at all. Just set up a desk lamp and use your phone or your webcam. It can save you a lot of time in the long run. And for things that you can't really take a photo of, you can always try to use 3D to create your own reference. In part 1, Christina talked about a lot of those resources that can help you with that. I just wanted to quickly add to that and mention how I sometimes use 3D models as reference, especially when I'm working on storyboarding. A good accurate model can save you a lot of time and hassle when you have to draw a character or an animal from many different angles. I encounter this a lot in my storyboarding work, and I find resources like Sketchfab to be incredibly helpful. And I think that's it for this video. I feel like we have covered a lot of ground when it comes to the use of reference in art and design, but if you guys think we might have missed anything, please let us know in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing for more content like this. As always, thanks for your time, and we'll see you all in the next video. Bye everyone.